treasure trove of never-before-seen emails, which were just released earlier today by Republicans on both the House Oversight and House Judiciary Committees, well, they show that Dr. Fauci knew that COVID may have been intentionally modified and leaked from a lab over in Wuhan. In a recent TV interview, the director of the CDC, she admitted that over 75% of the people who died from COVID after being fully vaccinated had at least 4 other underlying health conditions as well. Just earlier today, the Republican leaders on the House Oversight and House Judiciary Committees, they released excerpts of emails, which they say reveal how Dr. Fauci knew that COVID may have been intentionally modified and leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Specifically, in a letter that they wrote to Mr. Xavier Becerra, who is the Biden administration's Secretary of Health and Human Services, these lawmakers, they pointed to a conference call that took place on February 1st of 2020, in which both Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins were on that call, and the topic of discussion was the virus's origins. Here's specifically what they wrote in this letter, quote, "It was on this conference call that Drs. Fauci and Collins were first warned that COVID-19 may have leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology and furthermore may have been intentionally genetically manipulated. It is unclear if either Dr. Fauci or Dr. Collins ever passed these warnings along to other government officials or if they simply ignored them." Now, actually, we did discuss this conference call that took place on February 1st in much greater detail on an earlier episode of our program of Facts Matter. That episode was published on December 23rd of 2021, so just a few weeks ago. If you want to check it out, I'll throw the card up in the top right corner above. But this letter to Xavier Becerra, it gives a pretty good summary of what took place. Here's what it says, quote, "Only 3 days later, on February 4th of 2020, 4 participants of the conference call authored a paper entitled The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2 and sent a draft to Drs. Fauci and Collins. Prior to final publication in Nature Medicine, the paper was sent to Dr. Fauci for editing and approval. It is unclear what, if any, new evidence was presented or if the underlying science changed in that short period of time, but after speaking with Drs. Fauci and Collins, the authors abandoned their belief that COVID-19 was the result of a laboratory leak. It is also unclear if Drs. Fauci or Collins edited the paper prior to publication." And so the way that this letter summed up the happenings is very accurate. I really appreciate how succinct it is, because what basically took place is that on February 1st of 2020, there was a large conference call that had several medical experts from different countries, including Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins, who were on that call. And during that teleconference, there were 2 presenters, both of them scientists, who presented the possibility that in their mind, the virus had leaked from a lab in Wuhan. That's what those 2 scientists said. That's what they presented. However, it was always strange that just 3 days after that teleconference on February 4th, so February 1st was the teleconference, and then February 4th, they published a paper called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, and that paper, it actually pushed forward the natural origin theory while almost completely dismissing the lab leak theory. And so these emails, they shed light on the fact that Dr. Fauci, he was actually sent this paper prior to publication, and he was asked to edit it. So then the next paragraph in this letter goes on to say this, quote, "On April 16th of 2020, more than 2 months after the original conference call, Dr. Collins emailed Dr. Fauci expressing dismay that the Nature Medicine article, which they saw prior to publication and were given the opportunity to edit, did not quash the lab leak hypothesis and asks if the NIH can do more to, quote, put down the lab leak hypothesis. The next day, after Dr. Collins explicitly asked for more public pressure, Dr. Fauci cited the Nature Medicine paper from the White House podium, likely in an effort to further stifle the hypothesis that COVID-19 leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology." In short, Dr. Collins was saying that even though prior to publication, they were able to edit this article, they did not go far enough. So the proximal origin article, even though it pushed forward the natural origins theory of the virus and essentially sidelined the lab leak theory, they didn't go far enough. He said they should have basically outright dismissed it altogether and said that it's not even possible. That's what the implication here is in these messages. However, you might look at this and you might have a very forgiving attitude because you might say, hey, Roman, you know what? Dr. Fauci, in editing this article, maybe he was privy to some information that we are not, and that's why he was able to outright dismiss the lab leak theory and promulgate the natural origins theory. However, according to this new trove of emails that were just released, that appears to not be the case. Here's again what these Republican lawmakers who are sitting on these committees wrote to Mr. Xavier Becerra, the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Quote, Despite Dr. Fauci claiming otherwise on multiple occasions, he was, in fact, aware of the monetary relationship between NIAID, the U.S. National Institutes of Health, EcoHealth Alliance, Inc., and the Wuhan Institute of Virology by January 27th of 2020. Dr. Fauci also knew that NIAID worked with EcoHealth to craft a grant policy to sidestep the gain-of-function moratorium at the time. This new policy, designed by EcoHealth and agreed to by NIAID, allowed EcoHealth to complete dangerous experiments on novel bad coronaviruses with very little oversight that would have otherwise been blocked by the moratorium. Furthermore, there is also evidence that Dr. Fauci was aware that EcoHealth Alliance was not in compliance with the terms of the grant that they were using to fund the research over at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Here's what the letter goes on to say, quote, "In January of 2020, Dr. Fauci was also aware that EcoHealth was not in compliance with the terms of its grant that funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology. EcoHealth was required to submit an annual progress report to NIAID by September the 30th of 2019 and had not yet done so. The committee subsequently learned that EcoHealth failed to submit these reports, presumably to hide a gain-of-function experiment conducted on infectious and potentially lethal novel bad coronaviruses." Now, on that last point, that's not necessarily news because we already knew that a few months back that those reports were not being submitted. Even Dr. Collins, the head of the NIH, had to come out and admit that the EcoHealth Alliance was failing to submit these reports. But when they actually did surface, they did show that there were gain-of-function experiments being conducted. So we already knew that. But what this trove of documents shows is that Dr. Fauci was aware, and then the big question is whether he was actually reporting this to his own superiors. Here's what the letter goes on to say, quote, "By January 27th of 2020, Dr. Fauci knew NIAID had funded EcoHealth. The Wuhan Institute of Virology was a sub-grantee of EcoHealth, and EcoHealth was not in compliance with its grant reporting, in particular, a grant that NIAID knew had gain-of-function potential on novel bad coronaviruses. It is unclear if Dr. Fauci reported any of these issues to his superiors. We need to know the entirety of what Dr. Fauci knew and when he knew it." And then lastly, at the bottom, the authors of this letter have a list of 7 questions that they would like Dr. Fauci to answer in order to, as they say, prevent any future pandemics from occurring and to help in any future pandemic responses. And then after this letter to Javier Becerra, they have a bunch of the actual emails, some highlights, as well as, of course, some redactions. I'm going through them now. By the way, the reason I'm in the sound booth was because these emails published pretty much as soon as I sat down to record the episode today. So I had to take a bit of time to actually go through them for myself. I'm still going through them. One thing I do want to mention is that I'm seeing a lot of messages come to me personally right now about the Project Veritas emails. So I just want to make super clear. So these emails were released by ranking members of the House, of basically Republican ranking members of the House. However, these are totally separate from the Project Veritas emails that were released late yesterday on Monday. And those emails are pretty explosive. I've been going through them as well, and they're pretty bombshell, pretty explosive emails. However, we here at the Epoch Times have not been able to independently verify that those emails came from DARPA, because those emails, according to Project Veritas, they came from DARPA, and they have some pretty bombshell allegations in them if they're true. But we here at the Epoch Times, before we do any kind of reporting on them, we just want to make sure, we want to check all the boxes, make sure we do our due diligence, and before we tell you what's in them, before we do a deep dive and see how they fit into with all the other emails that we've gotten so far, in this case with Dr. Fauci, whether they are actually accurate. Because, I mean, to be honest, in this space, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of misinformation, and then there's a lot of disinformation. And so, you definitely want to do your due diligence before you believe anything blindly. So we're doing that before we report on them. However, in regards to these emails here, I think they're pretty interesting. They're definitely never before seen, and what they do is that in and of themselves, there's no like big bombshell in here, but they do shed more light on the happenings that we know have been going on behind the scenes with all this subterfuge between the NIH, the NIAID, Dr. Collins, Dr. Fauci, and these other government officials, how they're essentially stifling scientific debate behind the scenes of scientists who, say, are questioning the natural origins theory, who are looking into the lab leak theory, etc., how they're working behind the scenes to stifle those debates, and how it appears that there's a lot of connections between Dr. Peter Daszak, the EcoHealth Alliance, Dr. Fauci, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and frankly, I mean, looking into this, I just wish there was more transparency in all this, because even with the emails that we get, as I'm reading through them, there's a whole bunch of things that are blacked out, that are censored to civilians like you and me, and so we're still not getting the full story. But with enough things coming out, perhaps we'll be able to piece together all the puzzles. And also, if Dr. Fauci actually does have to answer these 7 questions at the end of this letter that the ranking members of the Committee on Oversight and Reform and the ranking members of the Judiciary Committee that they're requesting him to answer, maybe then we'll get more pieces of the puzzle with which to figure out what's actually happening behind the scenes. Otherwise, until then, Roman in the studio, back to you.